Greece, Cyprus, ancient Rome and the Middle East. The University of Sydney's Nicholson Collection of Antiquities is on display at its Chak Wing Museum. In this podcast series, we hear from the museum's curators and academics about the fascinating story these objects tell about ancient cultures and civilizations. We hear about the work of the university's archaeologists and the digs they're involved in. We also speak to Professor Vrasidas Karalis about the current state of play with the return of the Parthenon marbles to Athens. The Nicholson Collection of Antiquities. You can subscribe for free to this Arts Wednesday podcast series at eastsidefm.org/series. This is Arts Wednesday on Eastside Radio, and I'm joined now by Assistant Curator at the Nicholson Collection, the Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney, Candace Richards. Welcome back again to Arts Wednesday.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we spoke to you a while back about the Egyptian collection, and we're slowly working our way through all the Nicholson collections. We talked to Craig Barker about the Cypriot collection, and today we've got you back again. A great pleasure to have you back here to talk about the Italian collection.
Yeah.
So the Italian collection dates back to about 1000 BC. So that's pre-Roman time. So are we talking about the Etruscans here?
Yeah, we have some really interesting kind of early Villanovan and Etruscan antiquities in the Nicholson collection. So that comes from the area that kind of Tarquinia is today, or that kind of area of Tuscany. And they're, I think one of the earliest Italian pieces we have in the collection would be this fabulous funerary urn from around 900 or so BC that has this amazing kind of very dark grey patina to it, and the decoration is very subtle, of little incised lines and things like that, and it's a really beautiful kind of cinerary urn, so you would place your ashes in that.
Because I'm quite fascinated by the Etruscan art making. I've actually got a print on my bedroom wall of one of the details from one of the painted Etruscan tombs from Tarquinia, as you mentioned. And so that sort of art making, do you get, is that sort of exhibited in the collection that you've got?
So what's a lot of the kind of really kind of detailed and beautiful wall paintings that come from that region are a little bit later, and they kind of convey a whole range of really exciting mythological scenes, as well as kind of banqueting scenes as you go into the afterlife. What's really exciting about Etruscan kind of culture, for me especially, is because there's kind of funerary banquets that you see kind of reference the Athenian symposia, these kind of drinking and eating feasting parties where you lay along these kind of couches and you have kind of the material drinks and things in front of you. But what's unique about the Etruscans is that they had both men and women reclining and enjoying that experience together, which I very much appreciate. The Athenian version was very much a male space, but the Etruscan funerary spaces are men and women together, which is really fun. And so from the collection for these kind of Etruscan kind of materials, obviously the beautiful wall paintings stay in situ, and you can find them if you go for a beautiful tour of Tuscany, if you find yourself lucky enough to be in that part of the world.
It's on my itinerary for May.
And then what we have in the collection are kind of the funerary urns and kind of ceramics that kind of were found in those tombs in the kind of early, mid 1800s. And so Charles Nicholson, who's our founder, travelled through that region and purchased antiquities of the Etruscan kind of material for the collection ourselves. And so, a lot of we have is things like early Bucaro material, so that really black polished drinking cups and plates, little fibula, like the material that you use to pin your clothes together. And those small kind of artefacts that you would expect somebody who's travelling to be able to purchase and pack and ship over to Australia. So I think size was sometimes very much on Sir Charles Nicholson's mind when he was collecting.
Yes, too much hand luggage.
Exactly. And we have these amazing kind of reliefs of kind of battle scenes on the front of these kind of beautiful, massive, sometimes really large stone and sometimes really small ceramic funerary urns that then on the top of it, the lid is actually usually a person reclining as if they are banqueting forever in the afterlife. We have quite a few of those in the Nicholson collection and some on display.
Because it's a really beautiful art-making practice, and it's quite joyous too, the Etruscan art, especially the wall tombs. So are they working in metal as well? They carving metal objects?
Yeah, you get lots and lots of different types of kind of bronze vessels, as well as things like clothing pins and mirrors and things like that. So one of the kind of, I think, highlights from the Nicholson collection is this beautiful 4th century Etruscan bronze mirror. And it actually is engraved with a scene featuring Achilles and Troilus. So this myth is one that's not passed down to us through the Iliad, but it is part of the Trojan War cycle. And what happens is we have Achilles is to defeat Troilus is a prophecy made to basically, if Troilus dies before to a certain birthday, the city of Troy will be able to be defeated by the Greeks.
The Greeks, yeah.
And so what happens is Achilles then kind of chases Troilus down into the sanctuary of Apollo, where, Troilus believes that he would probably be safe. And Achilles decides to kind of make a bit of a transgression in the sanctuary space and pulls him from his horse and kills him. And so this kind of really violent scene is actually on this mirror. And so you actually have Achilles reaching up and grabbing Troilus by the hair.
Wow.
And we know the name of these two figures because it's actually written in Etruscan, not in Greek, in Etruscan.
Wow.
The Etruscans have their own language. It's a very different script. It's an Indo-European language. And while we have some letter forms and kind of some words and things like that are known, it's a really interesting kind of translation issue in the history of kind of different languages and trying to understand the ancient world. Language is always really important and key to understanding that. And the Etruscan language itself is a very complicated and unlike anything else that we know of in the region.
Has it been completely translated to date? Is it they still finding a way through it?
I believe that there is the majority of the language is known and the alphabet and things like that are known and they've been worked out. But then there are different letter forms and things like that can pop up from time to time. And so, this mirror is fabulous. And what's great is the fact that the Etruscans kind of really grabbed onto this Achilles and Troilus myth. You see it painted on the wall paintings in Etruria, and you see it represented in vases and in beautiful items like this mirror. And that's really unusual. It's such a kind of interesting kind of aspect of the Trojan War to pick up on. And as I said, we actually don't have many texts that reflect this. It's only from the images and the iconography that we've been able to piece together this particular part of the Trojan War cycle. And part of that is because the Etruscans did believe that they were the descendants of Troilus.
Oh, okay.
So it ends up in that way. So it's interesting to see how a lot of these myths that, a lot of people think and they know as Greek actually do permeate and kind of the cultures mix together in lots of different ways. And the Etruscans pick up a lot of material that's coming to them but make it very much their own and have their own legends and their own stories that they might tell about these items.
So then about 750 BC, the Romans came along and changed everything. And you were talking about Troy. They also have these creation myths too. And I want to ask your opinion on this because there are two almost conflicting foundation myths for Rome. There's the Romulus and Remus twins who are suckled by the she-wolf. And then you've got the story of Aeneas coming out of Troy who hooked up with Queen Dido of Carthage and then left her to go and found Rome. So is there any evidence of these myths or is they just purely just mythology?
Well, like I said, and that's the thing is Rome, as most people would think of it, they're not actually thinking about this really early version of Rome. They're thinking of, like most people, when you think Rome, you're thinking of imperial Rome or late Republican Rome when, they're quite a dominant kind of world power at that point if you put it into those terms.
Yes.
In this kind of really early 750 BC, this kind of geometric kind of period is what we call it for the kind of Mediterranean region oftentimes, you're actually talking about small kingdoms, small states, and each single one of those. And so the Etruscan culture kind of really flourishes and continues on far past the founding of Rome. Like a lot of the objects I'm thinking about and talking about those the beautiful wall paintings and things like that come from much later in the second and third century. And so what ends up happening is that all of the kind of individual kind of groups or cities or kings would actually have their own legendary story, right? As in there's no, so yes, there is a Romulus and Remus kind of myth of the founding of Rome, But then you've also, and you are right, that there are other accounts of kind of the Aeneas period. And what we do think is this is over time, obviously, if you play a game of telephone, you know how much you can change the words and bits and pieces and the meaning of things as time goes on. And so you actually have a conflation of mythology all coming together in a mixing pot. And so individual people would kind of connect themselves to different mythological stories. And a lot of that is about how you retain power, how you justify your leadership and things like that. So I don't think that there isn't any kind of right or wrong per se. These are foundation myths that blend together. So it's not that one is true and one is false. It's that they're both accurate and reflect different traditions that as Rome kind of the momentum builds to become larger and larger and larger, the kingdoms kind of meld together and their different stories will take place depending on who the leadership is at the time and who's justifying their origin story, if you will.
Because I mean, these myths do stand the test of time. They filter down throughout history. I mean, we've got the Purcell opera, who's got the story of Queen Dido saying goodbye to Aeneas as he sails off over the horizon. So they're very long-standing.
And this is actually something that I absolutely love kind of researching and thinking about is how the ancient world transposes and brings itself down to us in the modern world, right? And there's a whole field of studies known as reception studies where lots and lots of very smart people think about this stuff and try and understand the different ways that we relay these stories and their relevancy at different time periods throughout history. So colleagues will study, definitely operas and things like that are thinking about these ancient legends and myths. And then, of course, in the modern day, it's, much more film and blockbuster movies and things like that grab onto these myths as well.
Yeah, well, Hercules and Brad Pitt, for example. Exactly.
And Hercules is actually one of my favourite characters because there's a new exhibition at the museum actually that's called Hercules Myth and Legacy. And it's about this kind of reception of the name Hercules. And Hercules is the Latinized version of Heracles for the Greeks because Hercules is tied to all of these cultures and it is represented throughout Italy as well. And what's really interesting is the name Hercules means something, right? The name Hercules, especially in that kind of post-Enlightenment period in the kind of 1800s, we're thinking that this, like the word Herculean becomes very commonly used to mean a massive feat and a massive strength. And what that means is that when kind of the natural history and sciences are being kind of things like taxonomy is becoming a discipline, and you have people like Linnaeus setting up this binomial scientific naming system based on Latin, he actually reaches for the Latin mythographer versions of all of these myths. And he uses that to name the world around him. And so by the time he got to butterflies, he ended up using parts of the Trojan War. And so you have butterflies named after Achilles and Troilus and Patroclus and all of the characters. But the name Hercules isn't applied in the same way. The name Hercules is special. And so it's usually reserved for the biggest or the mightiest or the strongest of something when it was discovered. And what's hilarious is, of course, 10 years later, someone discovers something bigger. But in northern Australia, we have the Hercules moth. There's Dynastis Hercules is an amazingly large rhinoceros beetle. We have a species of river kingfishers called Alcedo Hercules. And we have a whole exhibition that explores this name Hercules in natural history as well as cultural kind of landmarks that, come from this kind of very European and Western kind of world traditions of naming things after the classical legends. And what's really interesting and what we've tried to reflect in the show is also how much this has obliterated local knowledges and as most people will know the maybe the classical mythology name for something, but will not know the Aboriginal Australian name for something from the local communities because those languages were systematically wiped out in favour of these kind of classical ones. And so it's a really interesting way to talk about lots and lots and lots of social history, Australian history, but also how these names come down to us. And so, yeah, we've got some really, really fun artefacts and animals and paintings out all about this name, Hercules.
I just love the way the Chak Wing Museum brings their various collections together in such an interesting and unexpected way, giant beetles and Hercules. I mean, it's incredible.
It is, and it's part of what makes my job incredibly fun, is that I work with so many great colleagues and we all share one big curatorial office, which can get like a bit of a madhouse sometimes, but it's so great for generating these ideas and working really closely with, say, Tony Gill, who's a natural history curator, to talk about these ideas and find specimens in the collection that reflect these kind of mythological traditions that I'm really interested in. And we work with an entomologist as well as social history and Indigenous curators to kind of bring it all together into one piece. So it's one of the really fun things about working here.
I bet. I'm talking to Assistant Curator of the Nicholson Collection, Candace Richards, and I'd like to just go back again to the Romans and the Etruscans. So they coexisted for quite a few hundred years. So was that a peaceful coexistence? Was there economy going on? Was there trade?
Absolutely.
Or was it just a war of attrition?
No. I mean, over time, there was absolutely the Etruscans do get subsumed. But, for the longest time, Rome didn't, to quote, I don't even know who I'm quoting, Rome wasn't built in a day. I have no idea where that quote comes from.
Probably Shakespeare.
And what ends up happening over time is basically that there are a series of wars that eventually kind of take place, and it's about dominance and it's about control of things like the economy, and it's time it happens. Humans, we're constantly doing this, right? It's basically one group kind of gets a bit larger, and then over time the kings start to jostle for position. Somebody wants more control over land equals, space to grow grain, you can feed your people, land and connecting to the river quite specifically to kind of sit on those trade routes and then build up from there is the key things. And so, there is this wars that go back and forth over the centuries until we get to that late Republican period when we have Italy, Rome kind of centralizing power, really taking over quite a lot of the kind of local kingdoms, and then kind of pushing out into the Mediterranean later on.
So when you pushed out into the Mediterranean, they form all these colonies basically from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. So in the Italian collection, are there examples of relics from those colonies, or?
So the best way to see these is actually in our numismatics collection.
Oh, okay. That's the coins,
Coinage.
is it? Yeah.
The Nicholson Collection actually has an amazing collection of Greek and Roman coinage. The Roman coinage is very large as a collection. I think we have nearly 9,000 coins in our collection overall, which is something people are really kind of unaware of. Part of that is because coins are very hard to put on display. Coinage is it's a very difficult thing to display in a way that means that people can really kind of look at the detail on these things.
Yeah.
But coins are amazing in tracking change over time. And what they're really great about is understanding the kind of different money systems that are going on, where the mints were, and the iconography of coins is really telling of what kind of politically is going on at that time. And so you do change your coinage, obviously, underneath different rulers, but you also change your coinage to kind of grab onto the symbols of the time. And so you get some amazing coins that are produced out of Carthage after the Carthaginian Wars that kind of demonstrate or at least pick up on these little kind of victories and things like that. So it's as you kind of push out through this kind of third and second centuries around the Mediterranean, you can study the coins to see these political changes in a big way. And it's interesting because I feel like it is really reflected in these politics that are really reflected in coinage, and it doesn't, in the same way it is for us, and it doesn't necessarily reflect in kind of your average kind of ceramics that you might be using on a day-to-day basis. You know, there is a lot of continuity just because your leaders are at war and, everyone's off, and it doesn't necessarily impact the day-to-day life or how you're going about your personal day if you are a Roman individual that's maybe not a part of the military. So you might feel the effects of war because there might be grain shortages and things like that. But over time, it's through coinage that you can pick up these nuances, whereas in the ceramics that you use in your beautiful home, it's not as obvious, if that makes sense.
Well, I guess so, because of course the ceramics would be portraying things like mythology, historical stories, whereas coins
cooking pottery is very plainware, and you need it every single day, and you don't necessarily decorate that. It might have some beautiful geometric pattern on it or something, and that's it.
Yeah, whereas coins are a reflection of the changes in the politics so specifically and so long-lasting historical records. Wow, okay.
Yeah.
We'll have to get to the numismatic collection one day. We'll work our way through this series from the Nicholson Collection. So moving on, we've got all the colonies around the Mediterranean. So are there anything apart from the coins that have appeared in Rome that they've collected in the Nicholson Collection?
Yeah, so what's really great from the Roman collection, that's kind of the strength of the Nicholson collection, is that we don't have a lot of material from, as I said, we have some of that Etruscan early stuff. We don't have a lot of Republican objects. We have, however, we have a lot of imperial Roman material in the collection. Yep. And that's largely because of when the collection was formed. So Sir Charles Nicholson went to Italy in the 1850s, just like he did Egypt, which we talked about previously. And what's really, really fun is in the University of Sydney archives, we have Nicholson's passport.
Oh.
And he was in Italy just before the modern unification of Italy, which means that he had to stamp his way through the Italian peninsula.
Oh, right.
And so we can actually track his steps as to when he was in different areas, especially when he was around the Bay of Naples region.
Because you've got the Papal States there. You've got
exactly.
Oh yeah. There's so yeah.
So this archival document is really, really important to kind of piecing together where he went to purchase these things, because he was buying in the centre of Rome, and he was buying a lot of material around the Bay of Naples. And the kinds of things that he was purchasing, especially in the Bay of Naples region, was our epigraphy or epitaph collection. And these are the funerary stones of real ancient Roman people. They're mainly from the 1st to kind of 3rd or 4th century AD. And so what these are is that they record the names of the people who died. Sometimes they record their age that they were when they died, and sometimes they record their profession. So we have a nurse, as a child's kind of nurse, and we also have several military officers who were part of the naval fleet out of Misenum, and that's recorded in their kind of funerary stones. And so we have about 65 or so in the collection that Nicholson bought back. And what's really great about the way that Nicholson collected, because he was thinking about setting up a university museum, something to teach ancient history from. He wasn't collecting for like his personal self, which means he didn't go, I really like this type of thing and get a bunch of one object. Instead, when he was picking out these epitaphs, he really captured the whole gamut of Roman society. So we have slaves, we have freed people, we have noblemen, we have military people, because he was trying to teach what Roman society kind of looked like and the various levels and stratification of Roman society, as well as kind of has a good gender balance as well between men and women and children that are represented. And so it's a really interesting kind of cross-section, if you will. So that's kind of one of the big areas of collecting that he kind of did. The other kind of material that he was really interested in collecting was portraiture.
Oh, okay.
The Romans are very well known for their portraiture, mainly because they do love a marble statue, as do we all.
As we do we all. Yes.
And what it is the fact that a lot of the time the kind of the statues of gods and things like that, sometimes they copied the style of the Greeks that went before them. And even sometimes the Romans made exact copies of statues that from the Greek world that were made out of bronzes and things like that. But bronze is a really useful material. And so you can melt that down for reuse. But before they did so, they actually made copies in marble.
Oh, right, okay.
And so one of kind of the key pieces of the Nicholson collection that many people know is what we call the Nicholson Hermes. There's a beautiful Hermes that dates to the Roman period, and it's a Roman copy of what would have been a Greek sculpture in the first place. And then we have a series of things like individual heads. We have a couple of emperors in the collection that are kind of the sculptural heads that you can find that were set up around not just throughout Rome, but throughout the entire Roman Empire. The way that you could convey your message to the people was through either coinage with your face on it or through portraits and images that were set up in ancestor, set up in shrines to the royal family and things like that, right across the Roman Empire.
I'm speaking to Candace Richards. She's the Assistant Curator of the Chau Chak Wing Museum. This is the Nicholson Collection. Now, you mentioned that Nicholson was collecting back in the time for education, and he tried to cover a lot of different areas and trying, to cover everything that he could need for teaching. So were there any gaps left in his collecting, and have you been able to fill those gaps since then?
Yeah, I mean, and that's interesting. So he did his best and tried to collect a lot of material for what he could. Obviously, he was basing it on what he could afford and what he could buy at the time. Mm-hmm. And so over time, we have developed and grown the collection, absolutely. Throughout the kind of early 20th century, particularly in the 1940s through to the 1960s, Arthur Dale Trendle, followed by Alexander Cambuglu, were the curators of the collection, and both of them were very important scholars of South Italian pottery.
Oh, okay.
So South Italy had a whole range of Greek colonies set up throughout the kind of boot, if you like, the lower part of the boot. Yes. And so they ended up purchasing in that kind of post-World War II era, when a lot of material came on the market following the war, especially out of stately homes in England who were selling off their collections for financial reasons. Okay, yeah. And so they were very active in really kind of making sure we had a really representative collection from South Italy. So lots of kinds of different types of red figure pottery. But even though for many people they think, oh, it looks Greek, the South Italian makers definitely had their own flair and their own style. Okay. They used different, even though they had similar shapes, they definitely made kind of their own stamp on it, if you will. So you have different kinds of representations, you have different focuses on mythology, and you have these really kind of interesting ways of incorporating faces into the kind of images and things like that. So you get these beautiful array of kind of faces or portraits of women that have these kind of really interesting kind of hairstyles and different types of sacos or hats that they wear and things like that show you the different types of dress and kind of interest in South Italy. So while Nicholson was very much focused on that kind of imperial period, later curators have definitely tried to kind of prop up the collection and make it much more rounded representation of Italy, looking for things like South Italian representation, as well as over time adding more portraiture and sculpture to the collection, because that was something that while Nicholson definitely tried to acquire and send to us, but it wasn't as successful. And so one of the really important kind of acquisitions of the 1960s is this amazing portrait of the Emperor Claudius. Okay. That has been reworked to be the Emperor Titus. Oh. So it's two emperors in one. Right. So was that a political decision, do you think, or was that just an artistic choice? So there's a couple of different ways in which we reuse material. So this is what and my research is around reuse quite specifically in the ancient world through to the modern period, of how we pick up and use antiquities and reshape and engage with them. And so this piece, you can tell it's a reused portrait, because the original of Claudius, he's kind of a wrinkly bloke. Yeah. He has this kind of sour, for lack of a better word, expression. And he actually would have had it was one of the kind of ancestor ones that you would find in one of the imperial temples. And so he actually had like a cloak resting just on the top of his head that kind of fell around his neck. And that, to be reworked, has been chipped off, and his hair's been reshaped, and his cheeks have been, because Claudius was a bit chubbier than Titus,
well, that was
and so
fortunate.
His cheeks have been rasped down. So you would look for something, because you can't, you can take something larger, make it smaller.
Not the other way around, though.
Exactly. Yeah. And so sometimes reuse is done. Someone like Claudius might have his portraits reused, not necessarily for political reasons. It wasn't that Titus had a beef against Claudius person, he wanted to wipe him out.
Yeah.
It was that it's that oftentimes when people are remaking things, it's like, well, actually, we don't need a statue of Claudius now because he's no longer our emperor. We need a statue of Titus because he's our emperor.
Yeah.
And so a local person might change it into the new emperor based on, a portrait they might find on a coin or something like that, and shave down those cheeks and try and kind of dig around the mouth a little to change the expression, remove that veil because it's in a different context, and pop that head into a new kind of, and the bodies are very, a lot of the time in Roman sculpture, you have these kind of togatuses or toga statues, and you can actually change the heads out of those. They were built so that you could actually take off the head, put a new head on, and they would still be in the right garb.
Okay.
So the clothing wasn't important in this way. It's senatorial dress, and that's what they look like. That's fine. We just need to switch out the heads to make it an actual portrait of a person. So, this is one of the more, and when we acquired that in the 1960s.
It sounds so postmodern. I mean, just change the heads.
Just change the head. And that's the thing is that you've got to think practically about a lot of the stuff. Some of the, and reuse was incredibly common in the ancient world. A lot of people think that recycling was a modern thing. And a lot of people think that to reuse or change something was either ideological in the ancient world or was because of a downturn in the economy. And a lot of the work that I'm working on at the moment is to kind of change out this idea and to really kind of re-examine reuse across time, and try and understand the different motivations for reuse as actually much more related to just good urban resource management.
Yeah, because, I mean, especially with things like building materials, you see them pop up. This was once something and now it is something completely different, but using the old building materials.
Exactly. And so, like in Pompeii, for instance, we have some amazing kind of inscriptions from the walls that actually list off reused materials for sale. Because it's a very sensible way of managing rubbish. It's a very sensible way of managing goods that are expensive and laborious to buy, and reuse just as it is now. If anybody owns a heritage home or has tried to do some renovations of a heritage home, it's very complicated and it can often be more expensive. And in the ancient world, it was sometimes more expensive to reuse material. It wasn't necessarily the cheapest option because of the labour involved in deconstruction and reconstruction. Sometimes it is cheaper to buy a new thing, but reuse still occurred anyway. And it's because it's how we need to manage our systems, how we need to manage our refuse. And it's only in the post-industrial era, and especially with the invention of plastic, that I think our communities have often forgotten how to reuse and recycle material, up until kind of in the 90s realised that we were creating a massive crisis, and then it started to reuse and recycling became popular again.
Yes.
But up until the Industrial Revolution, this was really common practice, and the Romans were really, really, really great at it. We've got some beautiful evidence that talks about this reuse, either of portraits like this one on display of Claudius/Titus, or of building materials and things like that as well.
So it's an ongoing process, museum collection, and I know that you have an archaeological dig that you're personally involved with in Paphos in Crete.
Yeah.
Are there any digs in the Italian peninsula that you're involved with?
Unfortunately not. I'm not working in Italy at the moment. However, the University of Sydney, I have a fabulous colleague. I work very closely with the Pompeii cast project. Dr. Estelle Laser and Dr. Catherine Welsh are the leaders of that project, and they're based here at the University of Sydney. And we're working with them at the moment on a couple of projects. And what they're doing is doing some amazing work, doing CT scanning, X-rays of all of those plaster casts of the victims of the eruption of Pompeii.
Wow.
And so what they're looking for is trying to understand how the casts were created. So in the 1800s, when the excavations first started, the cast manufacturing process has changed a lot over time. So they're really analysing that, but they're also looking for the skeletal remains that are actually encased within the casts to determine much more about the lives of the individuals themselves, as well as to try and kind of remove some of the fictions that have been created, because some of the casts have been made, they're made out of the cavities in the ground that are left from the remains of the people as they've gone.
Yes.
And decayed over time. And so they're not an exact copy of these individuals. They're often warped and changed because of the way that they might have been against another kind of object or leaning against a wall and things like that.
Okay.
So they're quite difficult to interpret. It's not as straightforward as oftentimes we think of, especially the way they're portrayed in the popular media. And so Estelle and Catherine's work is to really disentangle all of those narratives and find out about the truth of these victims, what they were wearing, and what their lives were actually like. And I think it's such a really exciting research project. And so here at the museum, the way that we are engaging with this research currently on display is actually with a recreation of Pompeii in Lego. So it's actually from the old Nicholson Museum. We've had the Lego Pompeii for some time now, but it remains such a popular hit with visitors, especially with school kids that come through to see us. And there is a Lego Estelle and a Lego Catherine in there doing their work. And the way that the narrative works for the Lego is that it weaves together three stories. One is the ancient town itself. The second is the story of the discovery. And the third is actually the way that Pompeii has kind of lived on in popular culture. And so you can find things like Pink Floyd playing at the amphitheatre, which is what they actually did in the 1970s. They have a live show from Pompeii.
Wow.
And so it's a fun way of engaging with history. And then next to it on display is actually a series of very small painted pieces from Pompeii, fragments of wall paintings.
Okay.
And they show the different styles of wall paintings that come from the houses. And these were collected by a guy named Jack Bergman. His full name is actually George Francis Jack Bergman, but went by Jack Bergman.
Okay.
And he was an immigrant to Australia following World War II. And it's during World War II that he was able to pick up these pieces and bring them back. His story is really, really fascinating in and of itself. He's born in Germany. He was Jewish. He fled to France. In France, he actually signed up and worked with the Foreign Legion in North Africa until he was interned. When he was released in Algeria in the internment camp by the British, he signed up to the British Army or Navy and actually joined the Allied forces and then was stationed in Naples towards the end of the war when the Germans were retreating backwards. And what's very interesting that a lot of people are not as aware of is the fact that actually the Allies bombed Pompeii and Naples considerably.
Wow, I didn't know that.
I think it's over nearly 200 bombs fell across the ancient site.
Wow.
And this is because they believed there was intelligence that turned out not to be true. Intelligence left that the Germans would be hiding in Pompeii because the story goes, or the myth goes, that they thought that the English wouldn't have bombed it because it was such an important historical site. But they did.
Like a few other places.
They thought that while the Germans were retreating, they bombed, over 200 bombs fell across the city itself, destroying a lot of the houses and making like huge problems for later archaeologists.
Oh, God, yes.
And so when the Allies came through and took over the south of Italy and Naples and were based there, soldiers did go out to the sites and were able to go up Vesuvius and have a look and have on their day off and all of that kind of stuff. Okay. And Jack Bergman was a fastidious note taker. He has so many diaries, and a lot of his work is actually in the State Library of New South Wales. Okay. And the diaries themselves are amazing because he's such an intelligent individual. He wrote in German, French, and English and Italian. So his diaries are whatever country he was living in at the time. So they switch languages quite a lot, which is very difficult for a researcher, I must say.
You need few translators on them.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's got amazing photographs of him at this place. He seems to be a bit of a ladies' man, I think, from some of his photography and who was hanging out with during the war. Okay. But he did and then what ends up happening is that after the war, during when he was in Pompeii, because he's such an amazing note taker, he actually wrote down the notes of which houses each of the little pieces of fragments of wall painting he was picking up come from.
Right, okay.
And so we have amazing documentation for these pieces. And so he disembarked the war and then moved to Australia just in 1946 or 1947.
With all these records.
With all of his material. He becomes a very important person connected to the Liberal Party in Australia. He raises money. He becomes a very important Jewish scholar, which is why his material is in the State Library, writing routinely for the Australian Jewish Historical Society and things like that. So he's a really interesting character himself, and we're the beneficiaries of his antiquities collection, which were donated to us in the 1980s.
What a fascinating story.
Yeah, it's fun, that one. And the thing is, most people don't know that the bombs were that it was the Allied forces that bombed Pompeii.
No, they kept that one pretty quiet. Look, Candace, it's been great talking to you, but you talked about quite a few particular items in the Italian collection. Was there any other ones that really stand out for you personally?
Oh, it's very hard I think one of my favorites is actually viewable on the terrace of the cafe of the museum, which is a 4th century sarcophagus. It's one of the original pieces from Nicholson's collection, and it's an amazing piece. It has these beautiful garlands that go around the sides of it, and these two big Medusa heads in the middle, and in the centre you can see the depression for the individual's head, whether they would have been laid to rest. And this, it's a more late Roman piece. Yep. It's a very common style that you see, especially around the Eastern Mediterranean, Roman Turkey, places like that.
Yep.
And you see them often in the big galleries around the world have these kind of sarcophagi. But ours, to me, is just an incredibly special piece because it's large and because it's cumbersome. The piece originally, when it was donated to the Nicholson, I have never seen it in any of the photographs. We have amazing historic photographs of how the museum was originally laid out in the early 1900s. And that's because it was so large and never really fit inside the museum as it was then, that it was actually placed outside. And there's been lots of different rumours about how it was used as a horse trough, how it was used as part of a garden bed, which it was. It was definitely part of the garden bed. And it was only taken inside in the old Nicholson Museum, I think in 2008 was when we got it inside the building. And then nowadays it's one of the feature pieces on the terrace as you outlook over the kind of Victoria Gardens and things like that, which is a really beautiful spot for it. But it holds a soft spot in my heart because it's always been this kind of really neglected but beautiful piece in and of itself. It's very robust, so it can handle this kind of more weathering and outdoor treatment, which is how it's always had and would have had as well in antiquity. But it's one of my favourite pieces and definitely one that you can enjoy with your coffee, which I think is wonderful.
Yes, or bring your horse along for a drink.
Exactly. That part we don't do anymore, thank God.
Hang on. Thank God you got a purpose-built building too.
Exactly, to be able to put these treasures in. So,
it's been a great pleasure talking to you today, Candace Richards, Assistant Curator of the Nicholson Collection. And we can't wait to get to the rest of the collection. We've got the Middle East, the Northeastern European, the Greek, and also the numismatic collection still to go. So hopefully we'll get you back on soon to talk about one of those collections.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's lovely.